Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm a senior editor with the Mises Institute. And joining me, of course, is Tho Bishop, my associate editor. And we're in the midst of a lot of back and forth about whether the Fed is going to cause a recession or not. So I want to talk a little bit this week about how should we criticize the Fed exactly? What is the bad thing that the Fed does? And there just seems to be a lot of obsession with talking about whether or not the Fed is responsible for the recession and how Powell is a bad guy for raising rates into a coming recession and causing unemployment. But what's interesting is that most of this criticism is only based on things that are happening in the extreme recent past. So what's ignored in this conversation is the fact that the real problem with the Fed is that it causes the boom, which inevitably leads to the bust. And I want to look at that a little bit because this is one of those issues where you hear a lot from people who don't like to talk about economics and where they think that it's useless, that we should just be talking about winning elections and politics is what matters and the culture war is what matters. But of course, the central bank is a huge instrument for increasing state power, for increasing the power of the regime. It basically gives great advantage to the regime in terms of the resources at its disposal. And if we don't understand how business cycles impoverish us and how what the Fed does is a problem for ordinary people, then you're going to lose the argument over one of the most powerful institutions in the U.S. today. And so it's not something that can be ignored. And it just falls under the phrase that we've repeated more than once, right? We study economics to learn how we're being ripped off. And the central bank is ripping you off. But it's not just because of the recession that comes at the end of the boom. They're ripping you off through the boom. And I just don't see how we could possibly win the argument against the Fed if we're just failing to ignore that earlier stage there. And I don't know, though, maybe you're seeing any good news. Are people learning this, or is it still really just sort of this short-sighted recent history? We're ignoring what happened 10 years ago and we'll attack the Fed, but we'll just point out that Powell's a bad guy because now there's a recession coming in and the Fed did things wrong. Maybe if the Fed did things right, then maybe it would work this time. And that just seems like a dead-end argument to me.
Well, I think if you look into conservative Washington circles, right, Powell is still a largely respected figure. They don't blame Powell or the Fed for the upcoming recession. They blame Biden and the Democrats, right? Which I understand from a political standpoint, but of course, pretending that the problems we have now are simply the result of 2 years of bad policies completely misses the game entirely. If we zoom outwards, though, you have, again, some very interesting dynamics going on, and let's call it the new intellectual right. And what I find fascinating is that you have two very different camps, and sometimes there's a little bit of overlap in terms of the takeaway, I think, on the Fed issue. But on one side, you do have a lot of these sort of dissident right. I guess influencers is a more proper term than intellectual, right? They're not publishing journal articles or things like that. They're very active on Twitter. And I don't mean that dismissively. They, often the output in some of the more influential right-wing websites kind of start and manifest first on right-wing Twitter. And there is, I think, a growing awareness that the Federal Reserve itself is a problem. You see it with kind of the broader interest in Bitcoin and financial technologies. You see it with conversations about there's a bit of that presence of the dollar is dying sort of narrative, latching on to headlines like China and Russia doing energy deals in their own currencies rather than the dollar. I think that there were major issues with that narrative. I think that vastly overstates the strength of the yuan and the capabilities of that as a true challenge to the dollar. I think the dollar's position is actually probably strengthening from a geopolitical strategy. But at least they're kind of capturing narratives that touch upon the similarity, the larger theme that the Federal Reserve is the consequence to the things we have going on right now, and kind of the American kleptocracy is sort of a phrase that you see kind of widely thrown around, both in dealing with discussions about Wall Street, discussions about the military-industrial complex, some of these financial benefactors of the boom ripping us off that you mentioned earlier. But then, of course, you have this other side of it that wants to kind of double down on kind of welfare state policies as the means of addressing current hardships. And so they are less interested in the role the Fed has played getting us to this point. They are more interested in the conservatives using their presumed acquisition of power in future elections to bolster welfare programs for their chosen groups of people, whether it is, child subsidization policies, kind of within that Hungarian model that is very popular in certain areas of the right. And so they're kind of missing the point that the pain that we're feeling right now is precisely the detachment from responsible fiscal and monetary policy, and kind of what narrative of that on the right ends up triumphing when we have a predictable crisis in the future is going to be, I think, a very interesting dynamic within, again, the interesting stuff within the modern political sphere. But one of the things I think people also need to understand, I think that, and I'm going to take the moment to say that I've been wrong about Powell. I think that we have been, we've assumed that there would kind of be a pivot, right, at this point in terms of the policies, that the idea that they were going to be as committed to interest rate hikes as they have been, and seem, at least rhetorically, committed to continuing in the near future, is something that, again, I didn't think Powell had it in him. Right? I thought that opportunism, particularly with this larger political dynamic going on, when you have midterms and the pressure that comes from that, Powell today was at a Cato Monetary Conference, a virtual conference, which is interesting in its own right. But he remained committed. That basically, his view of history is that the biggest mistake is loosening monetary policy prematurely. Now, again, it'd been interesting if that had guided his policies in the past, particularly the late 2018 sort of pivot, when there was an attempt at tightening during kind of the peak of the Trump boom. But he seems, his historical narrative that he is trying to sell, and at this point, I don't see any sort of institutional criticism within the Fed itself to veer away from this, is that they're going to continue to double down on these aggressive rate hikes, prioritizing inflation, still over 8% by official numbers, over the concerns about the recession. And again, while it'd be better not to be in this perspective, at all, it'd be great if we're not dealing with the sins of past policymakers. That commitment is a notable turn from what had become Fed policy normalized, over the past 10, 12 years.
Well, don't apologize too soon. You might still be proven correct. We don't know how soon the pivot might come, or once the employment data starts to really show problems. We haven't actually seen how they would respond to any significant decline in the employment data. So the jury's still out on that one. And although his rhetoric is definitely very good, he still could make his mark as Arthur Burns Part 2 rather than Paul Volcker Part 2, in the sense of, if he does lose his nerve when employment starts to actually go down, then you would have something similar to what you saw in the 70s. Now, as you noted, he's been saying, you don't want to do that. I'm afraid that we'll do what we did in the 70s. But the question is, once the numbers actually start to worsen, will he follow through on that? And I don't know yet. But I am shocked that he's actually shown a willingness to go above 3% on the federal funds rate. But I guess that's just because the market hasn't responded at all. And this gets us right into what we're addressing today, because I don't follow the political side of things so much as I follow the Wall Street guys, the financial Twitter guys, the people who, a lot of them are, of course, mountebanks and con artists, the people who are financial advisors, and they give out lots of advice on Twitter and through social media and so on. And they're always predicting what the Fed's going to do. But you never hear a peep out of most of them when the Fed's actually inflating. When the market's going up and the Fed's expanding the money supply, that's fine. They don't complain about that at all. And they might say, "Oh, well, maybe let things rise a quarter point or so on." But don't get carried away, Fed. And it's now that the Fed's actually starting to talk about raising rates that you're seeing a lot of memes out of these financial sector people about your unemployment is a price I'm willing to pay, with a picture of Powell, that sort of thing. But that's all just so focused on just the last few months, right? Since he started raising rates, it completely ignores what came before, when all these financial guys were cheering the Fed on. Oh, yes, keep the money coming. They might occasionally throw in some token thing about, what's the Fed going to do about their huge portfolio? I don't know, but whatever you do, don't kill the golden goose. I want to remain bullish on everything. And so the whole rhetoric is so lopsided. And just another illustration that it's not just government people. Most of the whole financial sector gets it wrong as well, unless they're those minority of guys who happen to have an affinity for Austrian school stuff. But before we go on, we should talk a little bit about the mechanics, right, of why this is bad, right? Why is the boom bad? Why is the boom the part you're supposed to be afraid of, and not so much the bust? And the fundamental issue there is that the boom is what creates the imbalance in the economy. It's what creates the malinvestment. It's what creates, on a moral level, the injustice of transferring funds from the productive part of the economy to the less productive part. And that's then what sows the seeds of the bust that comes afterward. And Lew Rockwell, back when he used to write his weekly column, he would often talk about, right, we don't want the state, its socialism and its wars and its booms and busts, because it is the state that causes that through the central bank. So you don't actually necessarily have to have an economic system where you have all these constant up and downs with these cycles of big booms increasing prices, and then there's a hangover, as Krugman calls it in his criticism of he would call the Austrian theory a hangover theory, this idea that you have this boom and then you got too drunk on the economic success, and then you have this hangover afterward where people need to get laid off. But the fact is there's a reasoned, it's not just some half-baked theory about, economies are like people who drink too much. That's not what the theory is at all. The theory is that by creating money with expansion of either money or other fiduciary media brought about in false ways through a central bank, that it creates a false economy, that it starts sending incorrect signals by saying, hey, look how low interest rates are. Hey, look how much money is in the economy. That starts sucking money and spending into certain parts of the economy, which actually wouldn't be profitable without printed money. And so then people flock to employment in those areas. Their employment starts getting bid up. Their wages get bid up. Hey, if you come work in housing, hey, if you come work in these sectors of the economy that benefit first from new money creation, which tends to be new housing production in many cases, but also lots of heavy industries as well. Those people get bid up in the industries that are related to those industries. And then those people, they start devoting their time and energy into those industries. And then it's revealed, as soon as you stop printing lots of new money, as soon as you stop adding into this flow of printed money that keeps the whole bubble afloat, then the whole thing collapses. The only way that bubble can be maintained is by continuing to add more and more money into the system. It doesn't take on a life of its own and suddenly start to work because you jump-started it with some money. The problem is it was never actually profitable on its own, and it depends on ultra-low interest rates for the duration. And so once you just take your foot off the gas pedal a little bit, you don't have to start into a big explicit policy of driving interest rates down, of doing what Powell's doing, of announcing that we're going to start tightening and all of that stuff. All you have to do is stop printing as much money as you were. All you have to do is start scaling back the actual increases year over year in the money supply, and then the bubbles start to pop, the unemployment goes up, the economy then has to readjust, and then you've got your bust. And so the whole thing is artificial and it's unsustainable. And that's why you get your bust. That's why from the very beginning, you're laying the groundwork for the bust. And if you don't let the bust do what the bust is supposed to do, which is to clean people out of these unprofitable industries, then it just continues into a new bubble. And that's what was never allowed to happen after 2009, when you had a lot of bubbles that had been built up on the previous expansion after 2002. Those were never allowed to actually clear out, to allow the sort of ratcheting down in these certain industries that should have taken place. And everyone agreed with it, all the non-Austrians. Well, what can you do? Unemployment would be so much worse if you didn't allow this to happen. So we have to bail out industries. We have to print money. We have to do tons of deficit spending financed with printed money. And if you supported all of that, then all you did was really support the blowing up of a new bubble that we're now seeing at risk of bursting in the very near future, causing a new round of unemployment because you've never allowed the economy to return to normal. And you can see that now, how the economy is just completely divorced from normal economic activity, and the fact that the stock market, it's all about now, it's not about market fundamentals. It's not about profitability. It's not about bringing great products to market. It's about, what will the Fed do next? Will unemployment be high enough? The stock market was actually rooting for higher unemployment because that would mean that the Fed would pivot sooner. Because all the market then cares about is they want their Fed pivot. They want new money printing because that'll make the markets more profitable. It'll make your stock price go up. It'll make your home price go up. So what they're actually rooting for is bad news to get a faster Fed pivot. The markets aren't supposed to function that way. It's supposed to care about stuff like having to do with the real economy, like worker productivity, like the ability to create new goods and services, like profits. But that's all taken a backseat to, will the Fed start printing money again soon? And that's what determines my stock price, my portfolio price. And so it's really, really messed up. And it illustrates just how imbalanced the economy is and how based on myths and fakeness and printed money the whole system is. And that comes out of this last 10 years of monetary expansion. So to sit around and just say, oh, gee, the Fed is ruining something really good that we had by allowing interest rates to head back up or by tightening the money supply, you're missing the relevant part, which is what came before this current bust situation that seems to be now coming into play.
Yes, the American economy right now is in a game of chicken, right? Who's going to blink first? Is the financial sector going to be able to scare the Fed to pivot? And you see this come out with the way that J.P. Morgan and the large banks are warning about disaster is near. It makes for great content on Zero Hedge, right? That basically we are setting ourselves up for a major crash, which again would be expected if the Fed does continue, is able to succeed at pivoting away from the monetary excess of the past, right? Like we should expect that crash. But yet you still have a lot of Wall Street actors still betting on that pivot. And what's interesting is if you zoom out, right, we can already see other central banks and how they're handling this. Australia's central bank today kind of signaled that they are willing to pivot against their own form of tightening right now out of fear of economic hardships coming down the line. Right. So you're going to see some central banks do exactly what their financial industries want to do in this. Europe, they were very slow to really engage in any sort of tightening at all. They just recently taken a 0.75 percentage point, I believe, increase the ECB. of course, they're doing so with a very, very specific major problem in their own right, considering the state of the energy industry within Europe, the consequence of all sorts of decades of years of insane energy policies over there that made them dependent upon Russia and then engage in foreign policy that was hostile to Russia and not exactly a great mix, right? And so again, it's going to be fascinating to see is the Fed really willing to commit. But now, I mean, you even have, one of those areas that has benefited the most from the current financial regimes, obviously, been the housing market, right? It became almost a stated mission after the popping of the last housing bubble to inflate a new one. When we're looking at what the Fed is doing, it's not only low interest rates, but it is massive growth of their underlying balance sheet. Mortgage-backed securities makes up a very large portion of that balance sheet. And so recently you've had Raphael Bostic, who is the Atlanta Fed head, who is talking about the possibility of the Fed needing to sell off portions of their mortgage-backed security holdings, which when you're already dealing with a cooling housing market nationally as the result of increased interest rates, which were resulting in much higher mortgage rates, you then dump mortgage-backed securities onto the market. It is going to be very interesting to see how that affects the values of these assets broader. And when we think about the secondary and third consequences of these interventions, again, the most popular job here up here in Bay County the last few years has been being a realtor, right? You're going to have a tremendous amount of secondary, and now Florida's kind of an interesting scenario because there is still massive demand for housing up here. I think in large part due to political factors and things like that. You just have a lot of people trying to get into the political barriers that Florida has. And so I think Florida might be a little bit more isolated than other parts of the country, particularly, you think like a California, can't keep the lights on right now either. They're very European right now. The impacts to realtors, the impacts to builders, the impacts to the industries that are connected, that are reliant upon those industries, right? They keep, pointing to employment as the golden statistic that shows that the economy is so much greater than those right-wing trolls out there warning doom and gloom, want to have you believe. We are still yet to see, putting to aside the secondary aspect of, those seeking jobs and those that have left the labor force entirely. I think that employment, those employment numbers are going to, there's going to be industries impacted that are going to end up being reflected within employment numbers, even if you have that secondary aspect where the consequences of inflation are driving people to secondary and third jobs, and there's still a lot of demand in certain types of service industries and restaurants and things like that. The structural problems that have been baked into the cake after, again, a decade plus of these policies. I don't think that the problem is within the modern political, the popular political discourse, you're not hearing this as a potential outcome of the policy decisions going on in Washington and elsewhere. And what worries me is the blind spots that you have then within the populace, where they're going to be unprepared for, again, say a lot of California realtors not being able to make a living doing what they've been very successful at for the last 6 years.
Right. And of course, you don't have to have unemployment to have a real decline in your income. You can just be working fewer hours. You can have a lower real income compared to the actual inflation rate, of course. But so much of that data doesn't capture the realities either, in terms of how much do you have to work in order to maintain your current standard of living, and how much is education going up in terms of cost. And a lot of that isn't really picked up in the CPI. We, of course, talked in the past. Lots of people have covered the issue of the shortcomings of the CPI. But if that's your only metric, and that's clearly the central bank's obsession right now, is, hey, look, the unemployment numbers aren't terrible, so things are fine. Which is why I say we still don't know how they're going to behave when the unemployment numbers go down significantly, and what they're going to say then when that happens, and how long are they going to stick with that. But winning the political debate on this is just so difficult, right? Because it requires you to have a memory that lasts longer than 6 months, because you have to then go back and look at what happened over the last 10 years in terms of creating the bubble. Where did all this money come from? What does the average person even know about the Fed portfolio, right? Which is, of course, a perfect example of how the Fed's monetary expansion has been a real problem, right? Because what's real estate really worth? What's the actual demand for mortgage-backed securities and for mortgage debt in general, when so much of it, trillions of dollars of it, are being bought up with printed money by the central bank? What's the market demand for it? Nobody knows. And nobody wants to find out too, because if you start selling it off, then the values could collapse, and you'll have a whole lot of landlords stuck with expensive real estate where you can't sell it anywhere for near what you bought it for, because the debt starts to collapse, and then the industry starts to have some serious problems in terms of financing, because there just won't be the money available anymore if just buying up these loans, these securities, doesn't look nearly as attractive as it used to be. So then what? And so we're such a long way from the economy healing itself after more than a decade of new money production. And most people are basically just ignoring that decade that came before last year. The idea that anything came before COVID at this point, or before Putin started causing inflation, which is, of course, the Washington line, a lot of this, it's basically non-existence in the minds of a great many Americans.
Well, of course, I mean, I think one perfect example that's come up in the news a lot late of, when we talk about, we don't even know the price of these financial assets on the open market, is student loan debt, right? I mean, the government owns over 90% of student loans. It has been government policies through a variety of different ways, both on the backstopping of, the purchasing of student loan debt directly, subsidization to university systems in a variety of ways itself, that increases the cost, sort of the cultural norms, the government protections on bankruptcy, right, which changes the way that entire debt contract is considered relative to everything else, right? You have obviously a massive boom within the industry of higher education, right? Think of if you had college degrees properly priced, again, not benefiting from all this financial intervention. What might the contraction look like of professors out there? Even if we look at, we put it right within the conversation about real estate. I know Auburn, Alabama, the amount of construction on massive student housing facilities, luxury student housing facilities, which, while I get that there is a certain upper class clientele that a university like Auburn attracts naturally, a lot of that is propped up by this student loan debt. And so you have this dynamic where you have millions of Americans that took on this debt for a variety of reasons. They do not have the same outs legally to get out of it. They can't default on it the same way that you could, a boomer could if they bought a piece of property in Arizona in 2007 at market highs, right? And now that the entire scope of that conversation is now simply on short-term debt relief, without any sort of conversation dealing with any of the factors that led us up to this point entirely. So we talk about the short attention span of these policies. That is, I think, one of the most clear examples of it right now. And this is where, again, I know Jeff Deist talks about this a lot. Like, I think one of the great failings of too many free market thinkers, I think our crowd has been better than most at this, but we're the heterodox in the wilderness, unfortunately, more often than not, is the detaching of defenses of free markets away from cultural, political, the sort of beating heart sort of, the blood pumping style of rhetoric, where you emphasize the role that economic plays in civic virtue. You emphasize the role that it plays in cultivating better morals and ethics, because the proper, if we remove the intervention that incentivizes reckless short-term behavior, that punishes prudent, responsible behavior, that you subsidize something, you get more of it, right? Incentives matter. And so our entire economic framework within not only America, but really globally, has created a structure that rewards the worst aspects of human nature and punishes the best aspects. And I think ultimately, if there's going to be any hope of really reversing, again, not simply the short-term consequences of these policies, but in fact changing the larger intellectual artifice that gives us the Ben Bernankes of the world, it is going to require not treating economics as a specialized discipline, neutral to these other aspects, but instead popularizing sound economic policies within these sort of issues that does a far greater job of actually resonating, real human beings, and not simply isolated intellectuals. And I know, obviously, you've written a great deal about the histories of this within kind of the success of American history, and kind of the highlights of kind of populist free market thought within the broader Western, English tradition. But like, there needs to be a kind of rediscovery and a way of taking that approach to the 21st century. If we're going to end up ever having lasting gains that really matter more than an election cycle.
So what is the proper way then to attack the Fed? I think first of all, you have to get beyond the idea that just what the Fed did 5 minutes ago is what matters, right? This is, of course, the perennial problem I think you encounter when you're trying to discuss all sorts of policies that generally are economic policies. The problem with economic policies is they often take years to play out for the problems to really come to bear. And you see this often it happens both in American, but also a lot in Latin American politics, where you have a big boom, lots of free and open spending, lots of money printing, and then people feel good, right? Mises talks about this. The psychological aspect of the boom is problematic, because even though it's so disastrous in terms of economics and what it does to the economy, people feel like things are going very, very well. And you see it in their language, as Mises points out, is like, it's good business, it's good times, it's an expansion, it's a boom time, it's all of these words that tend to communicate good feelings. And then when the recession comes, it's all downer stuff. Oh, it's a collapse. It's bad for business. It's hard times. And so that just sends the message that what you need to fixate then on is just the bust. And so just mentally getting beyond that with people, with voters, is really problematic. And you can say the same thing about deficit spending, right? Even divorced from the aspect of the monetary policy that's required for deficit spending. That's a whole issue of itself. But we just look at like, hey, so they spent freely, they ran up huge debts. Yeah, sure, that's a big tax increase for the next generation, but things are going fine, and they'll figure it out at some point in the future. And so people, they're interested in what's going on right now, what's benefiting them now. And then if they're doing well, they also consider themselves to be really, really smart. You see this a lot of time with investors, right? Who think they're geniuses in the stock market because they invested at the beginning of a boom and then they made a lot of money, and they think it's because of something they did. whereas they should probably thank Jerome Powell. But at the same time, it's just constantly laying the groundwork, both bad fiscal and bad monetary policy, for the future. And boy, it's just really unrewarding then to beat that drum about, I know you feel great, I know you got a job right now, and it feels like everything's fine. But actually, these policies that are going on, you should be condemning them if you care about laying a sound foundation for economic growth in the future and for your children. And it's just real difficult to deal with that. And that's how we see that cycle repeating itself in Latin America constantly, is the guy who came in and did the responsible policies with a cut back government spending, that maybe cut back inflationary monetary policy. What comes afterward? It's always a recession. That's what happened to Martin Van Buren, right? After the Jacksonians got rid of the central bank then. Oh, look at this horrible recession. I guess the Jacksonians caused it. Let's blame those guys. They were really trying to put together a much better, fair, and more moral and sound economy, but they got blamed for it by the voters because the voters just saw the economic problems that came out of the necessary readjustment. And I guess what you got to do is just really focus then on the inflationary aspect of it, but people don't even see that, because you might have what is seemingly a non-inflationary boom. Why? Because maybe worker productivity went up a lot, maybe global trade helped keep prices down, all these disinflationary factors that can come into play. And that's what really has kept inflation pretty low until recently, is international trade was booming. You had a lot of worker productivity from improvements in technology, and people didn't notice the asset price inflation that was going on. It was really just the last few years that people started to notice that home price increases were just completely bonkers and out of control. All you had before that was homeowners say, hey, look how much my assets are going up in terms of price. So I guess things are great. I guess things are fine. Not caring that first-time home buyers were in deep trouble then, and that eventually causes some significant problems in the economy. It also makes rental prices go up significantly. But we ignore that because there was enough of people who owned assets to say, who cares? But what we started to find, and this was increasingly showing up in the research, is that actually the last 10 years was really bad for the middle class in terms of their real wealth growth. You had huge amounts of wealth growth among people who owned huge amounts of assets, all again due to that expansive monetary policy. But the advantages accruing to lower middle class, regular middle class people were far less obvious, far less clear, far less good. But since that didn't show up as much in the CPI, it was like, inflation's 1.5%. We got to get inflation up. In fact, the central bankers were telling us that there was too much disinflation in the economy. And we've got to break through to people to explain to them that, okay, the CPI, that's not enough if you're really trying to see what's being done to the economy under boom conditions. You have to look at asset price inflation. You have to look at how much the billionaires are benefiting from the monetary expansion, as well as the fact that the inflation you're paying as a lower and middle income person, which is impacting your income on a much larger percentage basis than some rich guy, that they're benefiting immensely from this. And they are the first recipients of the money because of the way that newly printed money enters the economy. It benefits people who are essentially at the top. It's those bond traders, it's the people on Wall Street, it's the people in banking, it's the people who already own lots of assets. So maybe that's the aspect of it you really have to start repeating and trying to nail down, is that, look, for people who are already rich, they're benefiting a lot more from monetary expansion than regular people are. That's one way I think you capitalize on the culture war aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that, look, you'll be the one who suffers the most from the inevitable bust that comes as well. Because we all know that people who are at essentially the lower end of the scale, when they're unemployed, the negative effects are much, much larger than if you're someone who has a lot of income and is sitting on a lot of wealth that really helps you weather an economic storm. And so everything that's being set up then by this monetary expansion, it impacts certain people far, far worse than others. And they're, of course, never told about that. And so you really have to somehow break through and explain this to these people. And that's a difficult job. But I do think clearly there's a cultural war aspect of it, a us versus them aspect of it that most people don't appreciate just how big it is. It's not some dry economic discussion, but you've got to get someone to listen to part of it first before you can do that, because all they can see then is just what's happening right now, and memories fade from what was going on 5 years ago when it seemed like everything was fine because you had a job.
Right. I mean, like it or not, I mean, what we have right now is a very much that this culture war, us versus them dynamic. And one of the things that's interesting is what is going to end up being. So we have red and blue America. While I am skeptical of your average American on either of those sides ever understanding the complexities of the way they rig CPI, right outside of just sort of a gut feeling that the government's lying to you. I think that the more complex the more complex aspects of understanding monetary policy, it's something that most people are never going to get, never truly have enough of incentive to care to that depth. I mean, it's difficult to just for them to know what day to vote is for many people, because like they've got other things going on in their lives. What's going to matter is that there are certain figures that become the leaders of red America versus blue America, right? And what is interesting is that on the right now, there is a complete void of what is the economic thinking attached to the modern leaders of the right? Milton Friedman's impact on American policy came because he was able to personally earn the trust of people like Nixon and Reagan. I mean, Nixon more on like the draft issues and some of that sort of stuff. But like, Reaganites, the Friedman crowd were able to ride the Reagan Revolution as kind of being the economic wing of that larger political movement. And what we have right now is, outside of some really dedicated protectionist types that were able to kind of attach themselves to Trump, there isn't a lot of very serious economic analysis that is currently writing up this change within the Republican Party, right? There was an attempt in 2012, right? The peak of the Paul Ryan years, where you had like reform conservatism, with a bunch of writers in the National Review that were trying to push their own agenda. Like, it was this weird combination of like carbon credits and, block grants, things like that. None of them had anything to say about the monetary issue. A lot of them, we're perfectly fine with the status quo at this point. It is going to be interesting to see what fills this obvious void when you have political change. And, it is good to see opposition to some of the aspects of the Fed and certain members of Congress, right? I think there is a with higher skepticism to a certain extent, right? But the problem is it kind of adopts these sort of impotent sort of policy tools as rules-based monetary policy, or sort of very sterile, sort of kind of tinkering at the edges, which ultimately becomes a defense of the status quo. And so when we have this very populist moment, what we need is the rise of certain successful figures within the right that have this, kind of Bannon-Knight distrust of the administrative state that can then attach that to the Federal Reserve itself as a core of the problem. Is one of the problems that we libertarians of various stripes always face is that one of the most powerful aspects of politics is the power of patronage, right? The ability to dole out from the public trust to reward your friends and and tax your enemies, right? That is a key aspect of consolidating political power at the end of the day. And if our economic goal is to turn off the spigot that so often serves as the pool of funds that you dole out to your friends. Again, and this is baked in. I mean, you have John Podesta, right? I mean, the head of some of the sketchiest aspects of the Clinton enterprise that is now made, the Biden administration is now put in charge of some sort of like green energy czar. Guess what the filthy, disgusting people who are going to benefit from this politicalization of money through this new position of the Biden administration, which is exactly the purpose of it. It is to reward their political allies who will then donate to the various campaigns they need to win certain elections down the road, right? We have to find a way of having those that support us be enriched by the results of our policies. And I think there is an argument, perhaps at a smaller scale, where, an aspect of kind of the conversation of higher education, right, of pushing people into trade schools. Well, if we can have an army of Fed skeptic electricians and plumbers and welders that are able to make very nice livings for them and their families and become very well established local elites within their town. They are the people that end up running the local county commission, or the county commissions and the chambers of commerce. That I think very much is kind of a bottom-up strategy where zigging while society is telling you to zag can benefit people financially. Another aspect, though, and this is where one of the more depressing aspects, I think, of the current financial situation has been the shellacking that the crypto space has taken, because crypto has had been an area where a lot of people skeptical, particularly on the Federal Reserve issue, were becoming Bitcoin millionaires, right? And unfortunately, the great irony is that a lot of the crypto industry was writing off of the easy credit environment that the Fed had created, right? And so you had all these crypto scams getting all sorts of venture capital from people with greater access to credit than they had since, right? And a lot of those are toppling down. You have an additional element there where greater regulatory pressures are screwing up certain business models for better and for worse. And so it would be interesting to see. So if I were looking for sort of a right-wing populist move to help benefit a certain class of people that can then become financial supporters for a funding the foot soldiers necessary to really take the political battle to the Fed, there has to be a way of, I think an aspect of that can be liberalizing, let's say, regulations on crypto and Bitcoin within the United States. I think one of the biggest tools, if we're looking for a very small but perhaps very potent policy tool, I think that Republicans take inflation seriously when they start recognizing the importance of alternative currencies. And so if you had a Republican that able to pass through the next kind of generic Republican tax bill, the elimination of taxes, capital gains taxes on Bitcoin, gold, silver, that immediately benefits the financial well-being of holders of gold, silver, Bitcoin, and the right. It's also got a quirky 10th Amendment aspect for it with all the kind of the state policy moves there. And so that is a way of using tax policy to financially benefit those most skeptical of the Fed. That makes them stronger, which makes them stronger allies to help the larger political crusade against the Fed. And I think ultimately that there has to be that element aspect of it for us to be able to overcome the incredible amount of disadvantages we have when we're facing against regimes that have the incredible taxing power, money printing, all that sort of stuff. Like it requires more than simply the intellectual battle. It requires strengthening those that understand this issue and are energized by this issue far more than, say, the masses will in some sort of mass populist outrising, right? Like it requires building up those who care about this issue the way that we do. And again, it would be interesting to see if that, like, that's where I think in the short term, that's going to be where those battles are. Can that Fed skeptic aspect of the new right become a important political force. And I think there's some reasons for optimism there. You look at someone like a Blake Masters in Arizona, who's been very critical of Fed. You have Cynthia Lummis, who is a senator from Wyoming, who's been very upfront about the crypto issue. You always have Rand Paul out there, who occasionally sounds like his father. I think that there's more people within that orbit right now within the political American right than you've had, since the days when it was Ron Paul kind of screaming alone in the wilderness. But whether that ends up becoming an influential enough portion of the right to have an impact is certainly up in the air. And again, we shouldn't be, we should be sober about. Again, we've got a lot where we're facing an uphill battle in a great way. The one silver lining is that economic distress creates all sorts of interesting outcomes that cannot be predicted. And if we take the Fed's word at it, that they are determined to focus on the inflation threat over economic troubles in the short term, and that might create precisely the sort of environment that you have some unforeseen outcomes.
Yeah, it's hard to, of course, dislike too much the fact that people are ripping on Jerome Powell and Fed policy. But you run into the danger then, of course, is that the Fed's just doing things wrong, that there's not something fundamentally wrong with what the Fed is supposed to do all the time, right? And given the Fed's dual mandate, they explicitly say, and they're correct in saying that Congress gave them a mandate to maximize employment as part of their dual mandate, and also to maintain stable prices. But politically, what that normally means, and we can actually see that in the history of the Fed and the rhetoric surrounding it, is that the emphasis is almost always based on maximizing employment. So the Fed is really there as an organization to focus on maximizing employment. And if inflation gets really out of hand, then people start to criticize the Fed a little bit. But great, it's good when you're trashing Jerome and you're saying the Fed's doing stuff wrong. But until you understand, at least on some basic level, that everything the Fed does is wrong. It's creating the boom that's wrong. It's creating the bust that's wrong. Then you're only going to have people criticizing the Fed when inflation's high. Seems to be the problem a lot of the time, right? And we see that all the time, right? The Fed ran into a major legitimacy crisis back in 2008 when you had a significant problem with the economy. You had a real recession. And fortunately, you had Ron Paul around, who was on TV a lot at the time, to place the blame on the Fed. And he managed to do that fairly effectively without a bunch of long, dry monologues about how exactly the Fed does that. Of course, he put out the End the Fed book, which I think was pretty good, and helped explain a lot of things to a lot of people. And then the Fed coasted for a long time in the decade after that because it seemed like things were out of control. So this may be another opportunity then with high inflation, especially if a recession comes, to really point out the serious problems that the Fed brings to the economy. And the Fed is not your friend. It's laying the groundwork for yourself or your children to see real big problems in terms of employment, in terms of paying your bills. But boy, if they can somehow, and I'm sure that if the Machiavellians of the Fed, what they really want to do is just do what's necessary to make it seem like things are under control. And then the Fed can say, hey, look, we solved your problem. And so the Fed can, of course, still succeed in that, right? They can somehow create the impression, like the Bank of Japan has done for decades, as their real standard of living has essentially gone down, create the impression that things are under control. And then at that point, you've got still an organization that has a lot of legitimacy behind it. So it's we don't want that to happen. But the question is, what do you root for then? If you really want the economy to get better, you do have to root that a recession will be allowed to happen and that the groundwork for a more stable economy might be laid, as it was to a certain extent in the early 1980s. Will that still happen to this extent? I don't know, because what happened even then is that the Fed starts inflating then in the late 80s, and then you get the golden age of the Fed, where everybody treats Alan Greenspan like he's some sort of demigod. And that's what really laid the groundwork for the massive housing price expansion after 2002, and then ultimately the housing collapse. So these things go in cycles. There's no such thing as a one cause, right? Even if we manage to convince a lot of people in this generation that the Fed is bad, who knows what could happen next? And even if you manage to get rid of the Fed, that doesn't prevent people from starting a new central bank a generation from now. So it's just an endless debate that has to happen. There's no day comes where you wake up and you're like, well, we finally defeated the very idea of central banking. We don't have to worry about it ever again. But the shorter term risk is that the Fed manages to extend its lifespan considerably and convince a lot of people that it has things under control.
And of course, it's precisely why we need to ingrain basic economic literacy as something as, a primary educational foundation, the same way that English and arithmetic and, everything else. Not that we do a particularly good job of teaching those things either in kind of modern American public schools, but in theory, basic economic literacy should be, an essential part of just a basic educational foundation. Of course, given that so many people are educated through state and government schools, and it's not a surprise they don't teach economics well, since, as you mentioned at the start of the show, economics does teach us who is ripping us off, and no one does it better than these very institutions. One of the, and my last point really, is that if we're looking for other reasons for optimism, the dynamic of the Fed, that it doesn't simply rob from us, but it rewards the worst aspects of society. We are, at least there's a silver lining where the figures of the global elites, the Klaus Schwab's, the various cartoonish group of supervillains that the Biden administration keeps plucking out of progressive think tanks to have public roles within their administration. The cultural agendas out there for display that are far beyond what I think anyone fearing slippery slopes a decade ago could have imagined for themselves. The way that they are so offending just average people, I think, again, it hits an emotional response. If we can tie this back to all these aspects of society that don't sit well with you, that offend you, the people that want you to eat you, that want to force you to eat bugs and live in a pod and track everything about you, this growing skepticism of these elites generally, again, all of those benefit from the current financial system, and tying anti-Fed policy, again, not Fed reform, but abolishing the Fed, breaking up the Fed, breaking up the federal government's control and their dominance within the taxing structure of this country that gives them the ability to allocate resources in the grotesque ways they seem fit. Tying these again, cartoonishly bad characters as a product of the system in place, and not simply the product of elections, I think is important. And again, I think this is a lesson that people are internalizing more than they have in the past. I'm not going to say every Fox News viewer yet is on board with abolishing the FBI, much less the Fed, but there's more of them than there have been in a very long time. And hopefully this general skepticism of institutions can be used to help shape the economic conversations going forward, because again, those are the ones we desperately need.
Well, unless anyone think that that's just a pipe dream and impossible that you could engage people on these issues, note Rothbard, right? In his work on the progressive era in the late 19th century, he just found it so delightful how just normal working class politics, party politics, involved long, complex discussions about gold and about monetary policy and about banking policy, and how you didn't have to be some college grad finance sector worker to be engaged in this stuff and to really find it important and to read articles about it, as shocking as that is, that the regular guys who were carpenters and plumbers were reading this sort of thing and had opinions about it. And Rothbard's right. That was a thing in the 19th century. And so the idea that that's impossible, of course, that's ahistorical. It is possible. I don't know what exactly you have to do to get people engaged in it again. Maybe They need to take a break from YouTube videos about van life, or I don't know what's required, but certainly it is possible. It has been done, and it's occurred in the past.
We need more gold standard memes. That's what we need.
That's what we need. We need a flowering of YouTube channels about monetary policy, just from an ordinary person's point of view. That would be quite refreshing if that were to happen. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up with that. I'm Ryan McMaken with the Mises Institute. Thanks to Tho for joining me today, and we'll be back next time. So we'll see you then. Thanks.